Hello, my name is Renee Price, and I am the founding director of Neue Galerie New York Museum for German and Austrian Art. For this program, we are pleased to present a lecture by Andrew Dolkart, Professor of Historic Preservation at the Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. Professor Dolkart has been described as without peer among New York's architectural researchers. In 2011, we commissioned Professor Dolkart to write a book on the history of the building housing Neue Galerie, New York. The result was 1048 Fifth Avenue, From Mansion to Museum, which charts the course of our historic home from its days as a private residence to its transformation into a jewel box space for the presentation of Austrian and German art. I trust you will enjoy his tracing of the history of our very distinguished building, which is considered one of the finest single-family homes ever constructed on Fifth Avenue. Without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Andrew Dolkart.
Thank you, Renee. As Renee said, I have written a book about the house where the Neue Galerie is located, and it was a really great pleasure to work on this project. It's the kind of project that I really love because it contextualizes the architecture of New York and the buildings that we love. So I'm going to speak to you about some of my findings as part of that project. So I'm going to share my screen. So, as Renee said, in 2011, the Neue Galerie contacted me about writing a history of their home because, as they noted, people often ask about the house, but they really had very little information about it. And I thought, what could be easier? A prominently cited house designed by one of America's most prestigious architectural firms, built by a very wealthy and very social family. Well, how wrong I was. For this family that built the house, that of William Starr and Edith Warren Miller, was exceedingly private. They were never in the news if they could help it, never had the interiors of their house photographed for publication in the architectural or society journals, as so many of their peers did, and generally made life for the 21st century historian extremely inconvenient. So it was with a lot of digging through archives and records that I was able to construct a history of the house, its residents, and its times, and also a few oral histories. This has resulted in the book published by the museum. In the early years of the 20th century, New York City was unquestionably the economic and social capital of the United States. The city's growing economies in industry, finance, and real estate resulted in an expanding class of enormously wealthy residents. For many of these wealthy New Yorkers, a palatial home on Fifth Avenue was a symbol of their rank at the peak of the city's social hierarchy. Fifth Avenue, two words that have been synonymous with New York's social elite. But why Fifth Avenue? On the grid plan, it is the same width as other avenues and had no special amenities. It was Fifth Avenue's central location that attracted those with money and social status. Fifth Avenue is running right down the center of this map. The poor and increasingly large immigrant populations lived to the far east and west, closest to the wharves and factories that dominated the island's shores. The farther from the commercial and industrialized riverfronts, the more expensive the real estate. Thus, Fifth Avenue in the center of the island was as immune as possible from the noise and filth of the raucous waterfront and their surrounding neighborhoods. The first wealthy New Yorker to build on Fifth Avenue was Henry Brevoort, who built his house in 1834 just north of Washington Square. Other wealthy New Yorkers followed. One of these was George N. Miller, and this is where our story begins. George N. Miller established the Miller family fortune. Miller was born near Hartford, Connecticut. He attended Yale for 3 years before moving to Charleston, South Carolina, where he made his fortune. His commercial activities in Charleston are somewhat unclear. His obituary in the New York Tribune states that he was a merchant. Miller's New York Times obituary provides a more detailed account of his life in Charleston, but also a more puzzling account, noting that he owned a large cotton plantation worked by scores of slaves. However, this New England Yankee, according to the Times, apparently had qualms about slavery. The Times noted, quote, "In the slavery agitation of 1845, he found himself so afflicted with Northern ideas that he brought his cotton business to an end and disposed of his slaves. He then moved to New York, where he had already had business interests. The obituary does not indicate how he, quote, disposed of his enslaved workers. But the use of this word does not indicate that if he owned any enslaved individuals, he gave them their freedom. Nor are there any known property records in Charleston or in South Carolina that confirm that Miller owned a plantation. The 1840 US Census indicates that he lived in a prestigious section of Charleston where many neighbors owned slaves. But unusual for Charleston, there were no enslaved people in Miller's household, just a single free man of color. So it's confusing. And it could be that the Times is wrong and that he was simply a cotton merchant, but it's really not clear exactly what his relationship with the cotton industry was. As soon as he arrived in New York in 1845, Miller purchased land on the east side of Fifth Avenue between 10th and 11th Streets and erected the large house that you see in the center of this picture. The house typifies those erected on Fifth Avenue at the time. It was a large, brownstone-fronted, Italianate-style dwelling that was neither ornate nor ostentatious. In 1855, Miller married Carolyn Chase of Boston, and they had 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter. Their eldest son, born in 1856, was named for his uncle, William Starr Miller, who had died 2 years before. Our William Starr Miller, whom you see here seated on the left, grew up in his parents' large Greenwich Village house, never wanting for anything. He graduated from Harvard and from Columbia Law School and is referred to in newspaper reports as a lawyer, and in 1905 in the New York State Census as a banker. Like other children of great wealth, he never had to work for a living and does not appear to have maintained an active practice in law, business, or banking. A brief notice of his estate following his death in 1935 refers to him simply as a retired capitalist. In fact, very few details are known about Miller's life. His obituary in the New York Times is exactly 57 words long and mentions no profession. Still, Miller traveled in the highest society with a home on Fifth Avenue, a country place in Rhinebeck, New York, which is probably where this picture was taken, and a summer cottage in Newport. And you can see him seated with his daughter Edith to his side, and Edith will come back into the story. Miller's name almost never appears in newspaper accounts of New York's business and social life, except in reference to lawsuits. The press enjoyed reporting on the legal problems of the wealthy, whether serious or frivolous, especially when they reflected poorly on those with money or power. In 1890, for example, Miller brought a complaint against his butler in Newport for assault, the trouble appearing, quote, to have grown out of a quarrel in which the servant was somewhat too independent to suit his employer. Both evidently did considerable threatening, but neither ventured to assail the other except with violent words. This suit was dismissed. In 1903, he instigated legal action against the Saugerties and New York Steamboat Company, which had given credit to Miller's head coachman, who was transporting the family's horses and carriages, but did not have the cash to pay expenses. Miller insisted that the debt to the steamboat company was not his, since he had not authorized his coachman to seek credit. His parsimony is also evident in an 1898 suit brought against his butcher, as reported in the New York American, in an article entitled "Wealthy Clubman Sued by a Butcher." This millionaire clubman owed his butcher $613.06 for 38 days of supplies. Miller insisted that he had told the butcher's staff that he would not pay more than $13 a day for supplies, an amount totaling $498. He did not feel obligated to pay the additional $117.06, and the court agreed. Although parsimonious with those who provided services beyond what he deemed necessary, William Miller appears to have been extremely generous in the purchase of jewelry for his wife. In 1902, Edith Miller owned jewels worth $700,000. One of the newspapers did an article about all of the women in New York who owned the most jewelry, and only 15 women in the city had more valuable jewelry collections than Edith Warren Miller. Miller had married Edith Warren, a member of another socially prominent New York family, in 1886. Edith's father, George, was a lawyer and financier with a passion for music, and he was one of the founders of the Metropolitan Opera. Edith Miller was reported to have been in attendance in the Warren box on several opening nights at the Met, one of the most prestigious events in the New York social calendar. Notwithstanding the occasional news reports of Edith's social engagements, like her husband, she was extremely private, and there is little public record detailing her life. Her arrivals and departures from Newport are often noted, and mention was occasionally made of the Millers' presence in Europe, especially in Paris. The Millers' presence in Paris is not a surprise, since both were Francophiles, a taste that became evident with the design and furnishing of their mansion on Fifth Avenue and 86th Street. The Millers had one child, Edith Starr Miller. Edith was raised as a proper society girl. During her debut in 1907, her parents sponsored a series of brilliant dinners and cotillions in both New York and Newport. Although Edith Starr Miller made her debut in 1907, she did not marry until 1921 at the age of 33. Over the strenuous objections of her mother, she married the 60-year-old Baron Queenborough of England. To the chagrin of William and Edith, who had remained extremely private, this unfortunate wedding received enormous publicity, not only in New York, but across the United States, in newspapers everywhere, and in England as well. Lord Queenborough was born into a titled family. He emigrated to the United States, where, curiously, he worked as a day laborer and a cowboy before going into business in St. Paul, Minnesota, amassing a fortune in banking and railroads, before moving back to England with his wife, New York socialite Pauline Payne Whitney, that is his first wife, who died in 1916. In England, he became a member of Parliament for Cambridge, resigning this seat when he was raised to the peerage in 1918. Lord Queenborough was active in conservative politics and was treasurer of the League of Nations Union for 16 years, resigning in 1936 when Russia was admitted to membership. Not only was Lord Queenborough a strong anti-Bolshevik, but he also became an apologist for Europe's rising fascist governments, joining the British Union of Fascists and praising the progress that Hitler had made in Germany. Lord Queenborough's two great loves were yachting and horse racing. His yachting interests frequently brought him to Newport, where he would have known the Millers. No match in recent years, wrote a New York Times reporter, took society so completely by surprise as that of Lord Queenborough and Edith Starr Miller. According to Lord Queenborough's daughter, Cicely, Edith Warren Miller detested Lord Queenborough, whom she claimed was a philanderer. This objection to the union explains the modest ceremony that took place at the Millers' house on Fifth Avenue and 86th Street, unannounced to the public on a hot summer's day when neighboring houses were shut for the season and most of the Millers' friends were in Newport. A report on the wedding describes how, quote, simplicity marked the wedding, which was quietly celebrated yesterday afternoon. The plans of the family to make the affair as simple and as unostentatious as possible were carried out successfully. Only a few friends and family members attended. There were no bridal attendants and no best man. The couple was not married by a minister from one of New York's socially prominent churches, but by the preacher from the Seamen's Church Institute, an organization dedicated to serving the religious needs of sailors. Family legend has it that the nuptials so upset the bride's mother that she was too ill to attend. The wedding ceremony took place in the music room or ballroom on the second floor of the house, followed by a luncheon in the first floor dining room. The couple had 3 daughters before Lady Queenborough filed for divorce in January 1932 on the grounds of cruelty, inhuman treatment, and abandonment. She died a year later in Paris before the divorce was granted. So let's turn now to the Millers' Fifth Avenue house. Society had been steadily moving north from Greenwich Village along Fifth Avenue as the city's population increased and as new neighborhoods developed. In 1856, for example, William B. and Carolyn Schermerhorn Astor built a large house on the southwest corner of 34th Street. In 1875, a ballroom was added to the 34th Street house, which you can see extending out at the back from the image on the right. This ballroom could accommodate 400 people, coincidentally resulting in social arbiter Ward McAllister's claim that only about 400 persons living in New York had any claim to be called society. This was the world that the Millers lived in, composed of a select group of families who lived on the right street in New York, went to the right parties, vacationed at the right resorts, and married their children off to the right people. Not surprisingly, the Millers were on the list of the Elite 400. Actually, when this list was published, there were 600 family names on the list. The Millers remained in Greenwich Village long after many of their social circle had followed the trend and moved uptown into new architecturally imposing mansions. The Astors had abandoned 34th Street and erected a huge double mansion on the corner of 65th Street in 1895, which you see here on the right. In January 1907, William Miller purchased 2 lots on the corner of Fifth Avenue and East 86th Street, about 20 blocks north of the city's 65th Street heart of New York society. That is where the Astors were. By the early 20th century, little developable land was available close to the Astors mansion, so the Fifth Avenue frontage between 86th and 96th Streets became the center for new construction. The pioneer in developing this area for the wealthy was Andrew Carnegie, who was seeking a site on which to erect his retirement home, now, of course, the Cooper Hewitt Museum. When Carnegie purchased land in the low 90s for his house in 1899, he seemed to have exiled himself to a location beyond what was socially acceptable. But within a few years, other sites in the area were purchased for development in what was referred to as the Carnegie boom. In the second decade of the 20th century, during the years when the Millers' house was under construction, the final mansion building boom occurred on Fifth Avenue. In 1912, the New York Times reported that in the past 2 years, 10 new houses had been built on Upper Fifth Avenue, and several others were in the planning stage. But there were contrasts, as you can see here. The top has a view looking north from 87th Street on Fifth Avenue, and at the bottom is Fifth Avenue and 90th Street, just south of the Carnegie Mansion. You can see the back of the Carnegie Mansion here, which has these billboards. And if you can see just to the left, there's a little shanty here that, as one newspaper said, one of the curiosities of that part of the avenue, from time almost immemorial, it was occupied by an old wooden shack, a reminder of the days of goats and rocks, from which were dispensed pink lemonade, peanuts, bananas, and other delicacies. Eventually, the Carnegies would purchase this plot and then deed it over to the Church of the Heavenly Rest, which is there today. The Millers did not purchase a vacant lot. They bought a brownstone row house dating from 1868 and a modest 5-story corner apartment building built in 1888. And they're all the way to the left in the image to the left. Both are evidence of the development of this section of the Upper East Side as a middle and upper middle class neighborhood in the decades after the Civil War. And you can see that really vividly in the image to the right with these 4-story and raised basement, rather narrow middle class row houses on 81st Street between 5th and Madison Avenues. The Millers purchased their new property at a time when the area was undergoing rapid change. Not only were the earliest houses and a few remaining vacant lots being replaced by new mansions and townhouses for the wealthy, but ironically, the construction of the Millers' new mansion coincided with the beginning of luxury apartment house construction in the area as well. Just as the Millers bought the site for their new house, construction was underway around the corner at 3 East 85th Street on a handsome 9-story apartment house with one 11-room apartment on each floor. On December 21st, 1907, the American Architect and Building News announced that the architecture firm of Warren and Wetmore was preparing designs for a new house for William Starr Miller on Fifth Avenue and 86th Street on property the Millers had purchased in January of that year. Warren and Wetmore was the most logical choice for the Millers' house, since Whitney Warren was Edith Warren Miller's brother, and the firm had previously designed the Millers' Newport house. And here you see Whitney Warren. And in addition, Warren and Wetmore had already designed several prominent Upper East Side mansions and townhouses, like the one you see on the right. However, Warren and Wetmore was not destined to be the architect. In 1910, the equally prominent rival firm of Currier and Hastings received the commission. There is no record of why the Millers changed architects, but we can only imagine the sibling issues between Edith and Whitney Warren. By 1910, Currier and Hastings had soared to the first rank of American architects. Their masterpiece, the New York Public Library on Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street, was a year from completion, and they had received many important commissions for city houses and country houses, and for other structures as well. The house on 72nd Street that you see on the left is still standing, as is Bellefontaine, just outside of Lenox, Massachusetts. Both Currier and Hastings had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and were major proponents of French Renaissance architecture as a model for contemporary design. Currier and Hastings created a Parisian townhouse for the Millers. The design is an adaptation of the early 17th century houses surrounding the Place des Vosges, which you see on the bottom. The architects adapted the Parisian precedent, created a home that is considerably larger than any single house on the Place des Vosges, but the main facade on 86th Street can be read as 3 separate residential units, a choice that Currier and Hastings made to break up the mass of this 100-foot-long facade. And you can see how the center of the Miller house projects out as if it's one townhouse, and then to either side, there are 2 other wings that can also be interpreted as separate townhouses, just as on the Place des Vosges. The detailing on the brick and limestone Miller house is exquisite. And without going into a detailed description of the facades, it's worth looking at a few of the finest features on the exterior. I love how you get this limestone frame around the windows that combines the windows on the 2nd and 3rd stories with these blocks where the windows are keyed to the red brick facade. And look at the beautiful deep red brick. And then at the upper level of the house, the cornice with its fretwork and raised panels, and a stone cornice and beautiful balustrade in front of the slate-roofed mansard with these ocular windows. The architectural education that Currier and Hastings received at the École des Beaux-Arts is evident not only in their love of French architecture, but also in the manner that they planned the interiors of their buildings. In accord with Beaux-Arts architectural principles, Currier and Hastings designed buildings from the inside out. For example, the arrangement of the 86th Street facade into a projecting central pavilion and wings reflects the 3 main rooms on the 2nd story of the house, one in each section of the building, with the ballroom or music room, the mansion's grandest room, in the central pavilion. For their interiors, the Millers did not purchase antique woodwork, mantelpieces, and other antique architectural fittings, as so many of their peers did. There was a major market for spolia, that is, building parts that had been removed from especially 18th century houses in France and England. But the Millers didn't go for that. Rather, the walls are paneled in custom designed reproduction woodwork, plaster, and marble of very, very high quality. The rooms on the 1st floor and 2nd floor were once lavishly decorated, largely with French and other European furnishings, highlighted with European, Chinese, and Japanese decorative objects, minor Old Master paintings, and French and Flemish tapestries. And here you see the one lived-in interior is the wedding photograph, and some of their furniture and fittings were illustrated in the auction catalog when their estate was auctioned. The Millers owned many pieces of original 17th and 18th century furniture, like the pieces you see here, as well as many finely crafted reproductions. Although some of the furnishings and decorative objects were quite handsome and together created the conservative old world atmosphere that the Millers sought, none of the furnishings were masterpieces. Currer and Hastings' design for the interior emphasized that the house was a private residence for the three members of the Miller family, a house with comfortable living rooms and grand entertaining spaces. Although the house has an impressive public face on 86th Street and Fifth Avenue, the interiors remain private, open only to those whom the Millers invited as their guests. The concern for privacy is evident as soon as one enters the house. A pair of massive iron and glass doors on the street open into a vestibule, a transitional space between the public street and the private interior. A flight of 5 stairs, which you can see on the right, in the vestibule leads to a second pair of iron and glass doors that open into the private hall. The stairs and the second set of doors create a psychological barrier only breached by invited guests specifically welcomed to proceed inside. And of course, what you can see is the spectacular stairway sort of beckoning in the distance on the vista from the vestibule. From the vestibule, a guest would enter the main hall, a space far more complex than in most contemporaneous houses, with its U-shaped arcaded ambulatory that directs visitors either into the stair hall straight ahead or into the dining room to the right or the library to the left. Architecturally, both the ambulatory and stair hall are simple spaces with plaster walls, relatively modest ornament, and black and white marble floors. The major architectural feature is the stair itself, a magnificent composition sinuously curving upward to the second story where the major entertaining spaces were located. And you can imagine crowds of guests just sweeping up this stair to the ballroom. The stair is constructed with marble steps supporting an especially ornate iron railing designed in the French Renaissance style. The stair is lit by an oval skylight with thin wrought iron bands. The most public room on the first floor was the dining room. The highlight of this room is the dark oak wood paneling curving at each corner. Over the entrance door is a panel that you see on the right, carved with a bowl of flowers flanked by fronds, echoing the centerpiece that would have graced the Miller's walnut dining table. A massive marble sideboard anchors the east wall of the room, while a fireplace mantel of the same marble appears on the south wall. On the floor, the Millers placed a Kerman carpet and unexpectedly 2 bearskin rugs. On the other side, the library, now the bookstore of the museum, was a far more intimate and private space designed in a Louis XVI style, incorporating built-in bookcases with open-work doors embellished with a web of thin gold wire and beautiful metal hinges and locks adorned with laurel. The major rooms of the Miller house were located on the second floor. The grandest room in the house is the central ballroom or music room, designed by Currer and Hastings as a Galerie des Glaces, a small version of the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. The ballroom must have been a dynamic space during parties, with light reflecting off of the mirrors, no longer there, framed by rose-colored marble pilasters and door enframelents. The mirrors have been removed so that paintings can be hung now, but here you can see in this photograph from the late 1950s or early 1960s, when the mirrors were still there. And you can see how exciting it must have been with the light from the chandelier reflected in all the different mirrors in the room. And we'll get back to this image a little bit later. To the west, the ballroom opens into the drawing room, designed in a mid-18th century manner. The room also has French-inspired wood paneling and a marble fireplace. The coved plaster cornice is especially elaborate, with female masks, pairs of lounging putai holding garlands, smoking braziers, and foliage. The drawing room was the most elegantly furnished in the house and had some of the Millers' most valuable antiques, including sofas and chairs upholstered in Aubusson tapestry, a large Kerman Palace carpet woven in rose pink, ivory, and sapphire blue. And to the east end of the ballroom was the tapestry room, hung with 3 17th century Flemish tapestries. The third floor of the house was entirely divided into private spaces, none of which survive. Other floors in the house contained service spaces, the kitchen in the basement, and servant bedrooms on the 4th floor within the mansard. Carrere and Hastings designed the Millers' house to accommodate lavish entertaining. Despite their aversion to publicity, the Millers entertained in high style. The gracious stair and well-proportioned rooms accommodated large numbers of guests. Although there were only 3 people in the Miller family, a house built on this scale by a family that entertained required a large staff. In 1920, the Millers shared the house with 11 servants, 4 men and 7 women from Ireland, Scotland, England, Sweden, Norway, France, and Italy. The Millers' nephew, Malcolm E. Smith, recalled that as a child, in about 1930, when Uncle Willie and Aunt Edith invited his family to Sunday lunch, they were greeted at the front door by 2 footmen. More footmen stood behind the chairs in the lavishly appointed dining room. Cicely Evans recalls that when she lived in the house with her invalid grandmother between 1939 and 1943, the entertaining spaces were rarely used, but there were still 4 servants in residence, as well as her governess. After Edith Warren Miller's death on May 17, 1943, the house was closed and the contents were auctioned. And this is one of the auction catalog images. Unlike the Fifth Avenue houses of most of the Millers' friends, which were torn down for apartment house construction, or in a few cases were donated to institutions, the Miller house was purchased by Grace Vanderbilt in 1944, after she was forced to give up her enormous mansion on Fifth Avenue and 49th Street. Grace Graham Wilson Vanderbilt, the widow of Cornelius Vanderbilt III, was one of the great hostesses of the day. According to the New York Times, Mrs. Vanderbilt, whose fame as a hostess was known over 2 continents for half a century, was one of the last remaining links between the regal pre-World War I American society with a capital S and the larger, more democratic post-World War II society. She entertained and was entertained by more members of European royal houses than any other woman in America. Like the Millers before her, Vanderbilt entertained lavishly in the 86th Street house, despite her failing health and almost total blindness. Her death in 1953 marks the end of the history of 1048 Fifth Avenue as a residence. Beginning in 1955, the elegant French-inspired rooms that once hosted New York City's social elite were put to a dramatically different use as home of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, an organization founded in Vilna, Lithuania in 1925 for the study and preservation of the history and culture of the Yiddish-speaking Jews of Eastern Europe and of the Jewish diaspora. As the YIVO collection expanded, an appropriate home was needed for its storage and preservation. When Grace Vanderbilt's heirs placed 1048 Fifth Avenue on the market in 1954, YIVO purchased the property. The first floor library was transformed into the executive director's office, with the lecture hall conference room in the original dining room. Files and card catalogs were piled high in the old ballroom, which became the archives, with a reading room placed in the drawing room. Although the physical fabric remained largely intact, the change in use had indeed become dramatic. From a bastion of wealthy New York society to a study center focusing on poor Yiddish-speaking Jews. And you can see here the reading room in the drawing room and reference desks in the old ballroom. Historian Alice Kessler Harris who began research in the YIVO collection in 1965, has commented on the ironic juxtaposition of what she said, as she noted, were tattered records of a destroyed lifestyle housed in the marbled quarters of 1048 Fifth Avenue. And she notes how fireplaces, sitting rooms, and master bedrooms became large, carton-filled offices where survivors of the Nazi Holocaust sorted and preserved. As the YIVO Institute's archives expanded, the Miller House increasingly failed to meet the organization's needs for modern archival storage. As a result, YIVO purchased a building on West 16th Street, just off of Fifth Avenue, to create a state-of-the-art archival facility. In 1993, YIVO sold the Fifth Avenue mansion to the Serge Sabarsky Foundation. The short report of the sale in the New York Times noted only that a new museum would occupy the building, focusing on Austrian and German expressionist art. This brief public announcement barely hinted at the fact that this purchase would result in the creation of a major new cultural facility in New York City, the Neue Galerie. However, it was not easy converting an aging and deteriorating mansion into an art museum with facilities for preserving valuable works of art and galleries in which visitors could view these works. To that end, German-born and New York-based architect Annabel Seldorf was hired to restore and adapt the historic interiors and also create some entirely modern spaces. As Seldorf has said, there was, quote, so much quality present that we wanted to preserve and underline its existing conditions. Modern additions that created an ideal museum environment and would meet contemporary building and fire codes were designed to enhance, not obliterate, the historic spaces. This approach is especially evident in the replacement of the ceilings in several of the historic rooms with luminous fields of light created by lighting designer George Sexton. And you can see the central lighting and the glass panels in the old ballroom. In order to preserve and restore original features while adding wiring, air conditioning ducts, and other mechanical systems, ductwork had to be threaded down chimneys and hidden behind walls, doors, and moldings, as you can see here when these doors are opened. Woodwork, plaster, and other features were carefully restored and, where lost, reproduced by talented, skilled craftspeople so that it is hard to tell what is original and what has been recreated. Some of the plaster was in very poor condition and really needed a lot of replacement work. The Neue Galerie opened to the public in November 2001, only 2 months after the devastation of September 11th. The Neue Galerie has taken its place among the great small museums of America, where art is displayed in intimate residential settings, permitting visitors to contemplate paintings, drawings, furniture, and decorative objects as they were designed to be seen. Although the Millers probably had no knowledge of Klimt and Schiele, they would probably be pleased that the mansion that they created has continued to welcome guests when the homes of most of their contemporaries have been demolished. Thank you.